So we are live now, and so let me at the very outset welcome you all. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first and inaugural edition of the IIMA Healthcare Alumni Special Interest Group webinar series. The alumni special interest groups at IIMA are platforms that bring together alumni, faculty, and students and leverage the collective intellectual resources engaged in specific areas such as healthcare, education, technology, analytics, public policy, entrepreneurial ecosystem, etc., to bear on the most challenging issues of our times. Faculty and alumni are already making stellar contributions, but the ASIG platform allows them to collaborate with each other much more intimately and to engage with industry and practitioners in a much more multifaceted manner. To facilitate this interaction, we've created 14 such ASIGs and more will follow in due course. The healthcare ASIG itself has been very successful and active in the pre-COVID days. And since the pandemic started, its members, most of whom are leaders of the industry, have left no stone unturned in coming up with solutions to the problems at hand, be it drafting government policy, vaccine research, making sure we have adequate stock of medicine to meet the requirements of our vast population, or simply making food and transportation available to the needy. I am very happy that we are launching the inaugural edition of the IIMA Healthcare ASIG webinar series today. The series aims to bring the thoughts, views, and expertise of renowned experts to the IIMA community. These are structured as either as panel discussions or as a dialogue between eminent speakers. Today's topic is government-industry collaboration during COVID-19 and way forward for the industry. We all know that, and we've been seeing that the pharma industry has been doing a great job in extremely challenging times. A significant enabler of that, of course, has been the collaboration the industry has had with the government. To share his views on this important topic, it is a privilege to welcome someone who needs no introduction, of course, Mr. Satish Reddy, Chairman of Dr. Reddy's Laboratories and President of Indian Pharmaceutical Association. We also have with us Professor Arvind Sahay, Faculty Marketing Area at IIMA, who has dealt with today's topic in a great amount of detail in the form of a case study. To all the participants, please send in your questions in the Q&A section. Now I hand over the platform to Professor Sahay to take over the proceedings. Professor Sahay, please.
Thanks, Anurag. And welcome to all the participants on this particular event. It is our pleasure to be here before you. The way we will structure the conversation today is that we will get started with a very brief overview of the small case that we had put together in collaboration with the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, industry leaders like Satish and the Government of India, which documented how we managed to keep the pharmaceutical industry going, not just at its levels, but in fact, it exceeded its exports in May of 2020 compared to the previous year. So we will start off very quickly by summarizing the events, this highlights of the events which led to that particular outcome. And then there are a series of items that we want to be able to talk to Satish in a little more detail, which have to do with the management of the production related issues, the supply chain related issues related to APIs and R&D and skill development, and more generally longer term, what are some issues facing the industry on which collaboration between the government and pharma industry in particular, but more generally, what can we learn from this so that as a nation we can progress faster with all of us working on the same team. So the genesis of the conversation today begins around the middle of May, when it became clear that we were doing reasonably well in getting all the pharma production and manufacturing and exports back on track, and there was going to be no shortages. And Sudarshan Jain, the Secretary General of IPA, suggested to me, and I was very quick to pick up on that suggestion, that we should document this, because this is a very unique case of industry and government collaborating together very, very closely. normally in most circumstances on an ongoing basis, there is a certain distance between the government and industry, and rightfully so to a certain extent. That is required. The government and industry should not be in bed together. There should be a certain amount of distance. However, more often than not, that distance becomes a little bit self-defeating. And to some extent, the government and industry have been at loggerheads on many occasions. This is one such clear occasion where the collaboration was very, very close. And it starts off in January when the pandemic is hitting China and supply disruptions are taking place of APIs from China. And the ministry is becoming concerned and industry is kind of also becoming concerned. And then by February, when the pandemic is beginning to rise in China, by the end of February, the Chinese have more than 9,000. By the end of March, they have more than 80,000 cases. And Wuhan is under lockdown. The province, Hubei province is under lockdown. And there are concerns. So the initial meetings kind of showed that there should not be disruptions, at least for a few months, because there were some stocks of the raw materials and there were some stocks downstream also. However, if the disruption had continued for more than 3 months, then it could have been a problem. In early March, of course, the government decided that there would be restrictions on exports, and the industry, of course, was not very happy about that because they felt that it was quite possible to do the exports given the situation that they were in. Around March 19th, there was a meeting that the Prime Minister called with all the industry leaders and associations, where it became clear that a lockdown would probably be happening, and there was some preliminary assessment of what the situation was. And then, as we all know, March 24th, the lockdown happens after a dress rehearsal on March 22nd. And despite the initial preparations, production did drop in the first 2 weeks from where it was to a fairly low level. But then within about a month, because there was very, very close collaboration of a type that we will explore in a little more detail between industry members themselves, between industry and the ministry, the different associations, we have different industry associations, the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, OPPI, IDMA, Indian Drug Manufacturers Association. Under normal circumstances, they have different paths and they have different agendas to some extent, but here everyone got together, collaborated very, very closely to ensure that production supply chains kept working. And by late June, we were back at almost complete production. In fact, by late May, end of May, the position was quite comfortable. So that is overall the story of what has happened. So let me now start off the conversation with you, Satish. As one of the 6 industry leaders who worked very closely over here, can you share with us, with the audience, as to what kind of was the first step in the leaders of industry getting together, and then the government kind of also coming on board? What happened? What were some operational processes that you followed to kind of get that cooperation on the ground and running?
Thank you, Professor Arvind Sahay. Thank you for inviting me to this inaugural series of the healthcare SIG, the groups. I'm very privileged to be invited here. So, as you said, so it was a crisis of a kind that none of us expected. We were not prepared for it. It was something which happened all of a sudden. It was pretty chaotic. Once it was announced that there would be the 21-day lockdown, when the Honorable Prime Minister announced it on March 24th. And in a way, about maybe 3-4 days before that, industry was kind of, getting a feel of it. Because as you said in your initial remarks, the Prime Minister did speak to us on March 21st, about 3 days before that. And then we assured him, saying that, looking at the trends of, what were happening in terms of disruptions, that industry would not let the country down. We would make sure that the supply of medicines will continue without any interruption. That's the assurance we gave him. So when the crisis started off, with this sudden shutdown, announcement of the lockdown, it was important that the industry needed to first get together to deal with the situations, because on day one itself, right? So it was announced the previous night, and then when we looked at it the next day, there were all kinds of issues coming up. Because it was a kind of a curfew. There was an essential service that was announced for our industry, but then the notifications which came, and then by the time they got translated at the state level, and then down to the area where, say, our manufacturing locations are there, the interpretations was one issue. It started with that. So if you see from the point of view of employees who had to, in the morning, get to work, if you see from the point of view of materials which had to be moved to the factories for the production to commence, there were issues. There were issues because on the way, people would get stopped, both the trucks as well as people, on the way, they would get stopped. And then we had to intervene, because we had to intervene with the state authorities. Okay, and then this point about, how did the industry get together? We said that, let's have a call every single day. That day itself we had a call. And then we said that, in terms of responsibilities, the CEOs of the 6 companies, right, of the leadership of the 6 companies, large companies, got together and said that, between the various pharma clusters where majority of the pharmaceutical units are located, that we would take individual responsibilities. For example, I took responsibility for Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So whichever company, not just the 6 companies, but any other company which would have any issues, I would take responsibility to deal with my team, to see how we can get these things together in collaboration with the state government. Similarly, also with other clusters like, whatever happened in Ahmedabad, whatever happened in Baddi, Sikkim, we said we should divide responsibilities. That was number one. Second part of it was to get clarity on the notifications. Like I said, this movement, of people as well as materials, there were confusions. We also had to make sure that, in terms of getting that essential tag, right, that it was an essential service, that particular tag for pharmaceutical manufacturing, not just for pharmaceutical manufacturing, but also for ancillary industries, right? So because we also have our suppliers, the intermediate suppliers, API suppliers, especially for the formulations units. We also had people like, our packaging unit, excipients, for example. These people also had to be in operation. Otherwise, we would find it difficult, because as we go by, because we just had inventory which covered us for maybe a month or 2. But then beyond that, you required support from all these things to also get them notified as essential. And this is where I think, the Department of Pharmaceuticals played a stellar role. They arranged control rooms, so that any issues that we faced, right? So right from starting with the high level issues of declaring them as essential for all these other ancillary industries, or if it was about movement of, people, in terms of clarity of notification from the center to the state, that was arranged. And then so also at the state level. For example, I had a conversation with the DGP of the state of Telangana, to talk to him that, that he should, if he establishes a control room, which he offered to do kindly, and also he had an industry representative there, one of our members from Dr. Reddy's and also another local company here, they were actually physically present in the control room. So WhatsApp groups were formed, and any issues which came up, immediately we would inform the control room. They would be resolved very, very quickly. And this was a 24/7 operation going on. And it was tremendous support, to make sure that, that we had the notifications clear, that the people would, have uninterrupted movement, and so also the trucks. So that was the initial phase of, getting the operations back in. Of course, there were issues, right? So because if you see from the employees' point of view, our important thing, like I said, was that we will make sure, as we promised the Prime Minister, saying that we would ensure uninterrupted supply of medicines. The second important thing for all the companies was the safety at the workplace. That was very, very critical, right? So if employees were facing issues, because one is, it's like in their movement. The other part also is, because of all this confusion and also a little bit of a fear psychosis that was created, and it played out quite a bit as time went by. Even the resident welfare associations, the RWAs, for example, in the spaces where they lived, people would not be allowed to move. So are people talking to them? Also getting assurance from the state machinery, the government machinery, to make sure that that they don't get interrupted. And also, if you see in locations where there's some locations, for example, which are close to villages, the employees wanted to come, the workers wanted to come, but then the villages would not, allow them to do that. For example, the Gram Panchayat, saying that if you go into these places, because it's a complete lockdown, you will bring it back to, the village, right? So it was these kind of issues that we were facing it in the beginning, and through very, very close coordination, to ensure that there's no disruption, we were working almost like 24/7. So every day it was this conversation between the CEOs and then the high level issues, we would flag it. And then Sudarshan has done a tremendous job, because he used to be in touch, as follow-up with the Department of Pharmaceuticals to get the issue sorted out. And then if even it was required at a higher level, one of the members would volunteer to make sure that, we got things back in order. So these were some of the critical steps in the initial stages, to at least make sure that, the operations continue, that there's no interruptions, and if there's any confusion in the notifications, that we would, fix it as soon as possible. And 24/7, everybody was available to make sure that things were sorted out. This was the beginning.
So in a sense, therefore, one was able to mitigate the effects partly of one can say, a normal functioning of different arms of the government. Sometimes the MHA does not know or have a complete view of what is the actual requirements of all the different areas, and the requirement that all dimensions of pharma be declared as essential services, not just manufacturing, including the downstream, upstream packaging, and the transportation related to pharma also be declared. So that was one. The second one had to do with the movement of personnel into the factories and outside. So on that particular dimension, if I can ask you to describe, so far as the people were concerned, did you bus them into the factories and back to their places, or did you have them stay in the factory itself, because there were some restrictions on that as well? So that was one thing that I was curious about. And the second one was, as you very rightly mentioned, there was a fear psychosis, and many people were reluctant to come to work also. I will get COVID and so on. Today, 5 months down the line, I think we realized that yes, it is a dangerous disease, but it is a manageable disease. But in the early days, I think there was a lot more of fear on this dimension. So how did you manage that as the industry leaders and having large businesses and large amount of employees that you need to motivate and keep them going through in those times?
It's an important point you were raising, because if I recollect those days in the very beginning, so one is there was no public transport, right? There were a lot of people who were dependent on public transport, so obviously it was not available. So obviously they had to depend on the company transport or their own transport. And if it was their own transport, they needed to get those permits. Even the buses also required those permits. They needed to carry some identity. So it had all kinds of intricacies to it. But then, it's like it was a company's responsibility. So once we took it upon ourselves, we made sure that, it's like all these permits were arranged. And like I said, it's like the people were placed in control rooms, and also there were control rooms, so that any confusion anywhere, right? There was always very quick, interaction, whether it was government to government or whether it is from industry to government, or if it was a specific instance, we quickly would, get into action. That was the part on the transportation. But what's also important, Arvind, in this case is, even when they reach the workplace, right? I will come to the employees specifically, but even when they reach the workplace, it was also important to practice some of these safety issues, right? So when I say safety issues, it's also about, because it's a fast-spreading disease, so people had to use sanitizers. And if you recollect, in those days, it was in short supply, because suddenly there was a spurt of, a lot of demand for it. There was importance of sanitization. They're using hand sanitizers, also sanitizing the workplace also internally. There was also the issue of social distancing, which means especially when it came to things like, even having lunch, for example, that you had to segregate the areas or, stagger the timings and things like that. So all kinds of issues, we made sure that, as a group, we would actually list down these guidelines. So if any company was thinking of certain things, we would share those best practices. We actually formed working groups, not just the CEOs, but even, the manufacturing occasions. My colleagues were part of that. For example, whether it was commercial, whether it was, to do with supply chain, a lot of areas, the separate working groups were formed so that they would find the solutions. They would develop the guidelines, and each one would share it, not just within the members, but also whoever required it. And then we also would sometimes, for example, seek, the what do you call, verification from the government itself, ICMR, for example, actually looked at our whole safety guidelines that we developed, in terms of how we deal with sanitization and how we deal with various practices, and actually, helped us, through the process. That's something we did. The second part, when you asked about, how did we motivate the people here, I think each of the companies and the company leadership played a stellar role, because we were talking to our people. We were giving them the confidence, because again, if you look at this whole crisis, we were an essential service. We were an essential service, and we were called upon to do a duty, which is, like I said, to make sure that no patient is left without medicine, right? For a lack of medicine, right? So that's something we had to ensure. It's a huge responsibility and a duty upon us. And this is what we always kept reminding our people, saying that this is not just about you. It's not just about your family. It's not just about your company. It's for the people in the country, right? There are sick people out there who are depending on you for medicines. There are doctors who rely on you to ensure that, the patients will get the medicine from you, right? So this is a higher calling that we use to motivate the people. We also, for example, in my case, I was also at the factory. Just I think on a Monday, on a Tuesday, this was announced. The next Monday, I was at the factory talking to the people, giving them confidence. Also our leadership team across the company, our CEO, our managing director, everybody was making sure that at different points of time that they would be visible in terms of leadership at the workplace, giving confidence to the people.
Wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. That's so nice to hear that one is leading by example, and that nothing works as well as that. So kind of moving to the next key thought that I wanted to ask you about, which is this whole business of APIs. Now, we all know in the industry that till around 2000, 2003, we used to produce most of our APIs. And then because of the cost differential, the APIs moved to China in a big way. And from a place where we were almost self-sufficient, now we are in a place where one is importing 60, 70%, in some cases almost 90% of the APIs. And clearly, that is something that is probably not a sustainable option now in this new world, post-pandemic world. During the pandemic, perhaps, and even now, we are kind of managing. But how do you see this evolving? I know that the government has now put in place the new policy, especially for 53 specific APIs, and there are going to be parks and so on. So can I request you to share with us some of the collaborative efforts which allowed the government to say that, okay, this is the cost differential, and therefore the scheme that we are going to put in place will take care of the cost differential. So it makes sense from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, for industry to start doing the APIs in this country. How did that come about?
Absolutely. So, Arvind, the APIs, I mean, it's clear the way you've described it, saying that we were importing a lot, but it's also important to know one reason or one or two reasons why this happened in the past, because India was, at a point of time, I would say in the 80s and 90s, we were one of the leaders in the APIs. The question, then it begs the question saying that, why did we reach the situation that you described? That, it's like we were importing almost 68% of the key starting materials as well as APIs from China, especially. And some of the key APIs, we were almost like literally 100% dependent on China. Some of the penicillin products and, so some other essential medicines, for example. So the reason is that, one is in terms of scale. For example, if I were to just start with the scale of production, so we were a large scale producer. So for example, Dr. Reddy's as a company was one of the largest producers of quinolones, ciprofloxacin, norfloxacin, some of the commonly used antibiotics, if you remember. And then we were dominating that space. We used to make it all the way from, the key starting materials. And then as time went by, there were 2-3 issues, which we faced. So one is with the advent of, the China, on the scene. China, for example, provided infrastructure, of a kind which was not seen anywhere in the world. If you see the special economic zones, if you see the kind of, fast track in terms of what they did on the regulatory side, fast track approvals and all that. If you see it on the utilities cost, for example, much, much lower. Subsidies, incentives, which they provided. And then when it came to technology, it was not a big issue because it's like they could source the technology from anywhere, including India, which they actually did at that point of time. So they built scale of a kind, which India could not match. And then slowly we started to lose the competitive edge. So that was the reason why this happened. So it's important to understand these reasons, because when we make a policy and when we design, we have to keep all this into account, so that when we make a policy, we also make sure that, we are competitive again. And we also operate at economies of scale, which can match and which can also beat China, for example, right? So that's important to understand. So that was one part of it. And also there was another policy, also the very stringent cost-based price control, which used to be in operation at that point of time, which put somewhat of a limitation, because even at that point of time, there were also APIs under price control. So slowly you found a lot of people exiting from those products, even if they're, the dominant manufacturers, because it was not viable for them, right? So they exited. And then that's how you saw in the first early 2000s, China completely dominated this space. Coming to the exact point of your question, saying that, so you had this cost differentials, China had scale, China had these advantages. So how does industry look at it, and how does the policy need to support this? One is, in 2013, the policy changed from a cost-based price control to market-based price control. So that was just one part of it. But then by the time, like you said, most of the products were still being imported because China had built economies of scale. It was important to bring out an API policy. It was important to bring out an API policy which addressed all these issues. It provided room for, covering all the aspects. It required the government to offer some incentives. It required government to offer some subsidies. It required government to address various aspects of the entire chain, which would help industry first reduce the dependency on imports, and then also invest heavily into this, right? So the government was working on it. There was a Katoch committee which recommended, I think, if I remember, way back in 2016 or so. But then I think it took time, because this was not the priority of the government then, to reduce import dependency. So it took time. And although finally, I think I forget exact year, but there was a particular year which was announced as the year of the API. But unfortunately, it did not see the light of the day. And then we were still faced with a situation where we were continuing to depend on imports. And this issue was flagged at several times. So most of the industry leaders in various forums had talked about this, saying that unless the government intervenes with the policy design, we will not be able to get through that. So how did it now reach the situation now? I think much before this pandemic started off, there were conversations. On January 1st, me and a couple of colleagues, were with the Prime Minister when he invited us, on January 1st, in fact, on the New Year's Eve, we in fact spent in Delhi, the meeting with the Prime Minister, where it was clear that, that we required API support, right? It was to be taken up as the most important thing. And we wanted to make sure that the policy was designed in such a way that it would take into account all these factors that I mentioned, if we had to compete with the Chinese, and also if we had to reduce the import dependency. And then the government started moving very fast, and the pandemic, right, although it was a crisis, it also gave us an opportunity to also come out with this production-linked incentive scheme, which was announced. In fact, sometime in March 21st, I think 3-4 days before the shutdown, the Prime Minister actually announced the scheme. And then it was to be, detailed out. And that's where I think we started, working with the government, and finally it got announced. There are certain elements to it which still need to be addressed, but the important thing is only two. I would say that industry should be able to operate at scale, so that it gets the economy of scale. It should be very, very competitive. So the various elements, whether it's the utilities, whether it's the financing, whether it's the infrastructure in the form of these industrial parks that have come out, all these factors need to come in, so that industry will be able to invest. Industry will be able to expand their production and take advantage of the government's policy that was announced.
And in this particular aspect of the policy making, very frequently it happens that, and this comes back to the place where we started, where we said that there is a certain amount of lack of trust between government and industry. And very often the government kind of thinks that the industry is always asking for SOPs or incentives or this and that. And sometimes there is also a sense that perhaps we need to have more numbers before we come to a decision. So here in a scheme like this, for example, a production linked incentive scheme, which is now going to have, there are, I think, 4 places identified: Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya, I think, or maybe 5. where there will be, and there is some place also identified where these API parks are supposed to be coming up. And there are some fairly specific cost numbers that the government has estimated. So I'm just wondering where this data finally came from. Of course, the pandemic is a powerful reason for everyone to start thinking that yes, we are actually on the same team together and we should be working together. And so, we are working together. However, that data would have come from somewhere, and I'm sure it would have been available earlier in some other forms. So I'm just curious as to where this data came from and how it was then all put together to say, okay, this is the level of incentive that we think that we will give. And the industry also says, yes, that makes sense.
So in fact, it was a sore point, Arvind, this lack of data, because even in other aspects, when we were dealing with the government during that time, because there was a simple thing, right? So because there was no organized data from one source, right? So the government always used to struggle with, making decision because you need to have the data before you make a decision, right? So if the government needed to get the data, who does it ask, at this point of time? Because if you say, for example, on the imports, right? So what is the level of imports that's there? Obviously, the customs and excise would have all that information. But the question is, it has to be compiled in a certain form. It has to be aggregated. It has to be analyzed, interpreted, and all that. But there was no time, right? So government had to get into action very quickly. So who had the data? So it asked, industry associations. It asked Pharmexil, for example, which had a lot of export data for that matter. It asked the industry associations. IPA was asked about the data. So this itself it has a very telling fact because to compile the data, and it had required a very quick turnaround. And my sympathies were always with Sudarshan during the time, because one, he had to satisfy the government by making sure that he's able to get reliable data. And then he had to talk to the industries, who were worried about, like where this data would be used and, what kind of issue would it lead to, right? So because it's always, like you started off saying, there's always this mistrust, which was always there between government and industry. And then here it was a crisis, right? So when it's a crisis, you can't keep looking for excuses. So, and then we quickly arranged for all the data from what we could gather, and we kept updating it. We provided it in a form which actually helped the government make those decisions, right? So one of the things, for example, that it would show is, even when it's looked at the cost, and then also I would also talk about, some of the consulting firms, right? So for example, they keep doing this work periodically. And why consulting firms? Because they're independent. Right, they're independent of the government, they're independent of the industry. So data from a third party and also analyzed very deeply. That was also some of the agencies were engaged in this work because they had done some work. For example, there was KPMG which did some work on API, for example, PwC did some work. We brought all this together. We brought all this together to say that, so here's the data, here's the request from the industry association, and here's what we think, would make sense. And then the government also would work with various agencies. Niti Aayog was involved, Department of Pharmaceuticals was involved, the DCGI was involved, his office was involved, there's Ministry of Health. There were several people who were involved, and finally they were working around the clock. And then, they would have, because of these virtual meetings, like of this nature, whenever it was required, even if it is short notice, 6-7 hours notice, we would all participate, give our feedback, we would be very open about it. And then finally the policy came about. Only point I wanted to mention here is because you mentioned on incentives. This was something, like you said, the government was not open to, right? This whole thing, whenever we said incentives, subsidies, this was not something the government wanted to look at because, it's like on one hand, they were thinking about, the point where they reduced taxes, which said that all the exemptions have to go. And then they would say, why do you need these incentives? And then we would clearly lay out the picture of China, why it became competitive. And if we have to be a global competitor and get the advantage, all we said was this. We didn't say that, incentives have to go on for long. Make it conditional, give it for a certain period of time, and make it reasonable enough so that companies who are already invested would invest more. People who had the technology and given up in the past, like fermentation, they would revive so that we become self-sufficient, which was the call of the Prime Minister. And also we would reduce the dependency on imports. We said for this reason, give it for whatever specified period of time. So that's why even the PLI scheme came for a limited period of time. And, it had all these elements, with data, with, all the areas of cost.
Very interesting to know, Satish. In fact, as a result of all of this, I think the exercise identified to the government also that the cost differential is between 9 and 23%. And the PLI scheme kind of identifies that, okay, this is the time for which this kind of support is needed. And with appropriate data, of course, then there is a greater level of confidence in the decision that one is making, even though it is not something that one would normally do as the government. And Ministry of Department of Pharmaceuticals, as well as the Drug Controller General's office, I think worked quite closely together with the industry on this. So that was really good to know. From the APIs, I want to move to a second aspect, which is also related to perhaps longer term, not just the efficacy and growth of the industry, but also the place of Indian pharma in the world, which is R&D and skills. Now, India is often been called the pharmacy to the world. We supply 40% of the generics medicines which are sold in the US and the UK. By value, we are perhaps less, but every third prescription in the US, I understand, is from medicines which are sold in India, which are made in India. We've got the largest number of FDA-approved plants in the world outside of the US, and the number continues to grow. Having said that, if one wants to really become the pharmacy to the world, then one has to produce new molecules also. One has to become an innovator, not in producing new molecules. Of course, we've done a very large amount of innovation, beginning from 1969 when the process patent law was implemented. Our innovation in reverse engineering has made us a very powerful producer. In 1969, 90% of the production was MNC pharma, 10% was local. Now it is almost the reverse, 85-15. So we have one of the largest pharma industries in the world, bar none. But if we want to produce new molecules, there are three things which have to happen in my view. One is that the capacity to create has to be there. The second is that the skill set to create has to be there. And the third, perhaps, as was told to me by an R&D leader, is that the confidence to create a new molecule has to be there. Of course, there are resources. MNC Pharma says that they take $1 billion to create a new drug, out of which maybe 600 to 800 million are simply for the clinical trials. So in your view, if I take the top 6 or 10 pharma companies in India which are actually doing R&D, and some of it is for new molecules, the expenditure is between 5 and 9% of sales. And some of that expenditure is for new molecules, DRL, Lupin, Sun Pharma, and so on, Zydus Cadila, including vaccines just now. How can we scale this effort? How can we make it so that we are producing enough new molecules as well? Right now, the total number of new molecules in India is probably less than what a single company like Merck or Pfizer might be having in its pipeline. Now, leaving aside the scale, Satish, just a few molecules that we can say branded, made in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and all of that. What will it take for us to get there? And in this, can you also tie in this issue of vaccine for COVID? We have 2 local plus the one which is an association with Oxford over here. So it would be wonderful to hear your views on that, because I know that you're also very passionate about this particular topic of R&D.
Sure. It's an important thing you're raising, Arvind, because if you see the future of our Indian pharmaceutical industry, it's very much dependent on us moving ahead in the value chain, right? It's exactly the way you described it. So we started at a certain point, and then, we proved ourselves to be, the pharmacy of the world, especially with our efforts in, generic medicines all over the world. And, we have reached a certain position. But if you see in the value chain, the most important thing is, at the higher end, is your ability to discover molecules. First thing is, it's like, do we have the capability? Right? Absolutely. Do we have proven capabilities? Absolutely, yes. Because if you see just to very quickly narrate our example of Dr. Reddy's, as a company, our founder, Dr. Reddy, right, my father, so he was extremely passionate about this, right? And he took this bold decision way back in '92, when the company was largely dependent on profits and revenues from APIs, to venture into drug discovery, right? And '92, he started, one of the first companies in the private sector to start drug discovery. '97 itself, we had a discovery, our own discovery license to Novo Nordisk. In '98, we had another discovery license to Novartis, right? So, I mean, his conviction was this, that, it's like, it's not just, the way you described, saying that the billions of dollars are spent by multinationals, so it's only left to them, nobody else can do this. He wanted to prove that wrong, because in the way the spend of multinational happens is that $1 billion includes cost of failure, heavy expenditure on clinical trials and all that. And so what is India good at? Very strong in chemistry. The Indians are extremely talented, because you talked about skill set as an important thing. And also, if you see the confidence and the conviction, people like Dr. Reddy had, all that came into place. And then because he proved it, there were also other people who got inspired by that. It's like more and more companies got into it at a very early stage, right? So at least now, if you see, there are a handful of companies. But a matter of perspective here, right? Because so otherwise the viewers will miss this. What would happen is, for a long time, we had a patent act which did not recognize product patents, right? It gave us an opportunity to, reverse engineer and, make a lot of molecules. And, that's why India became the hub of APIs and then moved on into generics, right? The policy itself gave us this. The 1970 Patents Act gave us this. 2005 was when the Patents Act was amended, right? So if you see the history of drug discovery in India, it's still nascent, right? You only have like a couple of, decades, or maybe 25 years, just that's it, before private sector got into this. Most of it otherwise was basically in institutions, and then if you see the whole structure now, to say that, what does it require? Along the 3 dimensions that you said, do we have the resources, financial resources to start with? Not necessarily, right? This percentage of R&D sales that you're talking about, and then you compare with big multinationals, we are nowhere close to that. It's a several exponential scale. It's like we don't even match that. Do we have research happening at a scale like it happens in most universities? Because if you see, even large companies, they also have universities that pick it up from universities. There's startups, small biotech companies whom they pick it up and then take it through development. And that's a substantial part of what happens in multinationals. So do we have that ecosystem here? We don't have that, right? Do we have government funding of research happening at a scale, and the startup culture which would be funded, at a level? Obviously, we're still not there. Not even at the level of, where, if you compare certain other countries, including China for that matter, we are still not there yet. But do we have the potential? Absolutely, yes. Do we require it? Absolutely, yes. Do you think the Indian government is cognizant of that? Yes, absolutely they are, because, in this whole collaboration, which is the theme of this session, the government also is collaborating with industry, in designing a policy which will address precisely this point, and not just one point of saying that, how can Indians discover drugs? It's also about looking at the whole ecosystem and saying what is required in that. If time permitted, I would have elaborated in detail, but just to say that, it's like the capability is there, the capacity is definitely there. Skill sets, you have to build on it. It requires a lot to be done at academic and research institutions. If you talk about the confidence, I think definitely it's there in the industry. It will only get enhanced if this policy on innovation is announced with all the right elements to it, right? So once that comes out, because the industry also has worked on it, and I'm sure it will see the light of the day very soon, it will give the confidence that industry will invest heavily into this space.
Let me take a couple of examples from my personal experience. We wrote a case on a particular drug which is called MALT1 inhibitor, which treats a particular kind of cancer. Now, this particular company which made this particular molecule or drug took it till about phase 1. And then essentially it licensed it to AbbVie. And there was an initial payment of a certain amount, as I recall, $30 million, and then milestone payments over a period of time that could amount in theory to $1 billion. Now, the question that I have for you is twofold. The first has to do with the choice of the molecules for research. And the second has to do with the role of the government and in the theme within the overall context of government industry collaboration. And there is a larger philosophical question over here also. And since Satish, you've been in the industry all your life, you are the ultimate insider. What will drive those choices? Because this particular molecule that I'm talking about was very specifically made for a Western audience. It is not even that relevant for an Indian audience. So therefore, where does the industry stand in terms of how it will choose molecules which may have a greater relevance also for India? Number one. Number two, how does the government then come in to put in place the policy scaffolding, which encourages the industry to do what it already clearly wants to do, but in a more robust way, in a more accelerated way, in a more productive way. In a sense, my question is about mechanism design. Very simply put, a mechanism is, I have two kids. Well, my kids are now grown up. They are going to college. But let's say they are 10 and 11, and I want to divide a piece of cake. And I'm busy. I tell them to divide it. So a simple mechanism to ensure that it happens without any problems is I tell them that one kid that gets to divide the cake, the other gets to choose first. So automatically there is a very high chance that it will get done equitably. There won't be any fights, and I have achieved my design. I have achieved my aim because I have created the right mechanism to achieve my goal of getting them to do the job in an equitable fashion. So my question to you essentially is, what would be your suggestion for a mechanism designed for the government and industry to work together on this, which allows the industry to produce the drugs for India and for the world?
Absolutely. No, that's a great question and a very pertinent question at this point of time, because like I said, we were part of this, committee which was working on the policy along with the government on innovation. And these are precisely some of the elements that we put it as part of the design, right? So let me just quickly take you through, it's like what the different phases are and why we make the choices that we make, right? So if you look at it from a company's point of view, a corporation, or the pharma company, so obviously, because it needs to maximize its return on investment, right? Especially because all of us are listed companies, the choices that are in front of, say, a large company, for example, would be in areas, it's like where we have a certain expertise, that we have developed in terms of making the choice, because we can't be all over the place, right? So we have to see, it's like, in which area do we have that? So, I mean, there's not much time to explain the detail of why we made a certain choice, but in Dr. Reddy's, for example, currently, previously when my father started, it was all about diabetes and, certain class of compounds in diabetes called PPAR gamma compounds. That went into a cloud, we completely stopped it. We are now into oncology. Some of the MALT one that you're talking about, we're also into that space. We're also into checkpoint inhibitors, for example. But these are the space we chose because of a certain capability that we developed in our subsidiary called Origin, right? That's what we did. So that's a choice of the company, and the design is very clear, saying that it's like you get to a certain stage and you license it out, because we can't afford the clinical trials if the product has to make it to the global market. We simply can't. What we can do, which we're also doing, is we can do the trials in India, right? Which we're doing for some of the molecules, and there were certain hurdles in the past, right? So again, through the policy, we want to address all these things. At least, thankfully, most of the things are there, but still a lot of things work to be done to ensure that clinical trials are done in India for original molecules. So I won't go into details, but certain regulations need to be also changed for that. Take, for example, the startup that you mentioned, right? If I remember, it was CuraDev who, licensed this to AbbVie, which is a great deal, which they did. Again, it's about a person, it's about a scientist, who had this idea. He worked on it. And then at a very early stage, he licensed it to AbbVie. We all hope it will be successful, because again, there's a lot of risk in this whole thing. Only 1 in 10,000 such molecules makes it into the market. But if it makes it, you can see the value it creates. It's like $1 billion drug, and it will put absolutely India on the map. Because it will have a globally discovered molecule, which ultimately is the dream for everybody, right? So these are the things in terms of how companies make choices, right? Whether it's a startup or a large pharma. Important point is it focused on India? And this is where we are saying in the policy, exactly the question that you asked, how do you also incorporate that in the policy? It can't be that, it's like we give all kinds of incentives, that we create an ecosystem. This is only to discover for the world and not specific to India, because India also has specific areas, right? Whether it's TB, for example, very specific to India and largely prevalent here. If you take various other specific diseases which are more prevalent in India, because it's a small portion of it, it doesn't mean that, we should ignore it. So at the policy level, we said, let's look at, it's like the disease surveillance and what does that data show up? Because data, again, we come back to that and say, it's like, from the data, what does it show? So we frame a policy around that so that those also are addressed, and who will take it up? Because there are tremendous institutions, right? And the institutions with tremendous capabilities who can take it up, but what's stopping them? It's again, this second issue in the policy, which is about funding, right? So there is a scheme, there are actually several schemes, BIRAC, all the way in terms of, funding discoveries which come from, say, institutions, coming from, colleges, for example, or coming from companies, for example, where they do, offer funding. But the question is, how is it organized, right? At various stages of discovery to help them, see it all the way through. It cannot be that, it's like somebody has an idea, and then he only gets funded up to proof of concept, right? He also needs confidence that saying that after proof of concept, if he has to take it to phase 1, if he has to take it to clinical trials, you need money which ranges from, almost something like 5 crores to almost hundreds of crores. The question is, how do you, provide this funding to ensure that, people are comfortable to take up that kind of a discovery? That was part of the policy design. And then last point would be on ecosystem, right? So you also need collaboration, not just from the government with various people, from the CSR labs, from IICTs and the government institutions, but also from industry, but also from the educational institutions, academic institutions, right? So because unless they develop to world-class, cutting-edge research, we'll never be in contention, in terms of cutting-edge innovation. So the whole ecosystem needs to be, designed, again, through the policy efforts where there's collaboration between industry and academia, because not much happens at all. Whereas you see that in, several notches up there in the developed world. Also from the government policy, also the funding which is provided to the institutions, to various, discovery efforts, to startups, to also, people across various parts of the discovery. All this needs to come together before we take the next leap. That's what we have recommended to the government.
We'll certainly be looking forward to that policy document as well. The PLI for APIs was, I think, a very, very good step forward. We have a few questions from the viewers that I want to kind of now forward to you for your views. So a couple of them are on the COVID vaccine. We have seen various agreements to produce and supply drugs for COVID-19 under emergency use authorization. What might be the potential size of this market, and what will the industry do for equitable distribution of vaccination? So this is one interesting point. In fact, I would add another question to this. What is your view also on vaccine versus a treatment protocol that already seems to be getting reasonably widespread within the country? At the point that some vaccine, more than one vaccine comes into play, it is approved and so on. At that point, do you think treatment protocols will be in place? A bit like HIV. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV, but there are treatment protocols in place and people can live even if they have the disease. So what is your view on that?
So on the vaccine, right? So sorry, you had asked me about a question about the vaccine. I didn't answer that earlier, right? So vaccine is an important area, right? So if you see about 50% of the vaccine production globally comes from India, right? And then there's several companies, who are leaders in this space. So especially during even the COVID times, the publicly made announcements, right? So Serum Institute collaborating with Oxford, AstraZeneca, that vaccine for production, also with Novavax, which they have a tie-up. Biologically, for example, which has a tie-up with Johnson & Johnson. So even in this vaccination, because the question was on the potential, it's huge, right? So for global supply, for the supply in India, it's a huge potential in terms of, what the vaccine manufacturers have. One, through the collaboration part of it. That's one part of it. There's another part of it where there are several clinical, where there are several trials going on at this point of time from Indian developed vaccines. Right, Zydus is part of that. There is Bharat Biotech. Biologically, there's several serum also. For example, there's several such candidates doing work at this point of time. If I'm not mistaken, they're somewhere in the phase 2 right now. Right. So the question about these vaccines is the following, right? And then coming to the balance about treatment. On the treatment side, if you actually see some of the confidence that at least people are able to gain and the fears somewhat subsiding now, including one of our own in the industry, which is Kiran Mazumdar-Shah, she also described in this blog, what she went through and how she went through it. And mind you, she was at home, right, quarantine, and went through it. And then she followed a certain treatment protocol, right, an antiviral, that matter, certain other things that she followed, and finally she came out of it, although she had mild symptoms. The important thing is, as time goes by, right, you will have more and more options for treatment. Currently, there is remdesivir, there is for favipiravir, and as time goes by, you'll have more and more such products. Even Biocon's Itolizumab is also there for cytokine storm and all that. And prior to that, there was tocilizumab. Now, so you'll have different options. There's convalescent plasma treatment available. There are also these monoclonal antibodies being developed, although that will take time. There's several promising candidates, and all of them are being fast-tracked. Important thing is, on one side, the regulatory pathway is simplified. Again, involvement of government in India as well as mostly overseas. Also, you have seen, where they're fast-tracking treatments. Even when it comes to vaccines, they're fast-tracking it. Again, in vaccines, the important thing will be that it's like vaccines are unlike the treatment part of it, right? Even when because you're giving it to healthy human beings, and also you're also giving it to high-risk people, right? People also with comorbidities. The side effects and all that have to be studied over a period of time. The outcome of that, right, on how it works on people, on different, the nature of the population, all that the data needs to come out of it, and all of us are anxiously waiting for that. So the more data we get, from the clinical trials and the studies that are being done, the more confidence we will get, and more confidence even for the regulators to approve it. Then comes a key question that you asked, which is how will it be distributed? Right. The important thing is it has to be distributed first for the frontline workers, right? Especially healthcare workers, doctors, and the nurses and all these people who are working in hospitals, because they're all exposed to this in a very high risk environment. Also, elderly people. So they're the people who need to get this, and also certain key, areas, where people that areas of population need to get this, and then also it has to go to the general population after that, and later on, if you subdivide it, the important thing is a policy also has to be framed for this, because the availability is not going to be that much, and also like I said, the data that comes out, won't be adequate for us to fast track, distribution, for example. It has to be staged. It has to be done in stages. The question is, you have to have a policy, to have enough thought behind it, and hope that the data is so good that, all of us, including you and me, also get this as soon as possible, because then we can get on with our normal lives, right? So that's very important.
So just to build on your response, Satish, on the part where you said that the government has fast-tracked a lot of, regulators have fast-tracked a lot of these processes to make the vaccine come sooner and everything. That goes back to where we started on the whole issue of collaboration between government and industry. Now, this is a very unique and peculiar time where, because of the crisis, we have done an excellent job in this collaboration, which has actually enhanced the reputation of the industry and of the country within India as well as around the world. But the longer term goal for us should be that this kind of collaboration happens in a systemic fashion, even during normal times. And so my final question to you essentially would be, what would be your thoughts on how we can make that happen, where there is a systemic way for industry and government to work together? Maybe there is a role for academia over there somewhere, think tanks, research bodies over there somewhere, so that it happens much more naturally. While these are very unique times where perforce we need to collaborate, we must collaborate. In normal situations, some distance also is required. Otherwise, there will be accusations of regulatory capture or crony capitalism and all of that kind of stuff. And for citizens at large, from a policy perspective, some distance needs to be there. But at the same time, that close collaboration also needs to be there. So what might be your thoughts on what could be the mechanism for that, the structure for that?
A couple of thoughts come to my mind, Arvind, on this, because see, one is just the way we collaborated during this time, right? So again, like you started off saying that, in the past we were at loggerheads, nobody used to trust each other and all that. Question is, it's like we have this, the situation where there's tremendous amount of trust, and give full marks to the government, and the various institutions within the government, that they took us into confidence. And then, it's like whether it was policy making, whether it was, it's like dealing with the crisis, and also, it's like, in designing policy to take care of the opportunity. I think all of us collaborated very, very well, right? So that was the important thing. The question then will be, how do we institutionalize this framework, in a normal way of working, to make sure that, it's like whatever happens in the future are all well thought out. There is expertise behind it, right? And there are also experts who are part of this. And then it's like, how can we say, for example, get speed of implementation into this, right? Here it was a crisis. That's why there was a sense of urgency, because we had to deal with it. The question is that sense of urgency will be of a different kind post this crisis. But the question is, how do you make sure that, that the implementation happens speedily, even when the policy is designed, right? So I think that's the part which I would stress on, because, we talked about data, and then I said it was a sore point, right? Because if you see it in terms of decisions to be made, if there's an institutionalized framework where, say, a neutral, body, can actually be the portion where be the central agency where all this data could actually be designed. There's a framework by which it's collected, and then it's all then made available, as an independent agency. That itself is a great start to begin with, because for any policy decision, I think data is very, very crucial. For a staggered situation like what we are facing in our industry, I think it's important to get the data together. So one I would say that. In fact, I would even go to the extent of saying that maybe it's your institution, Ahmedabad, should actually look at this very closely and then say, it's like, can you, get government, and industry to collaborate, because you're again a neutral body here. If you can get us to collaborate to saying, how can we design this framework, right? And make sure that, from the industry, so that, it's like we don't keep anything to ourselves. We provide it from the government. What is it that they're looking for? And, how can they build expertise into it? If you can design this, that would be a great thing. And it always, brings me to, what happened with an institution like Tsinghua, for example. Why I thought of, institution like yours is Tsinghua in China. It's a university where, with a lot of expertise there. When they had to design a regulatory reform there, especially to promote innovation, they had, the best of the government people working in collaboration with industry, with the institutional experts, so that, it comes from that university, as a focal, the focused, concentrated point, which really transformed how China looked at innovation, for example. Again, it continues to build on it. So institutionalizing that framework. And then the other part also I would say is, it's like, especially in terms of the bottlenecks, right? They're all very clear, right? Here again, I would say industry point of view also. So for us also, right, for example, if you ask the government, they would say, we're also divided somewhat. There so many associations and, each one coming with different issues and all that. But now we have come together in a crisis where all the associations gave a point, and that also you mentioned in your case study, where we are saying that there's a common agenda for all of us. Innovation is an important thing. Whether it's the pricing, for example, stability of policy, all these are common issues on which I think we are saying the same thing to the government. The question is, it's like, how do we make this, working with various associations together, and that there's an effort to do that. Also from the government side, right? Say, having said about industry, I also say about government, there are various arms of the government. The question is, who do we talk to, right? There's a nodal agency, which is Department of Pharmaceuticals, whom we talk through in the crisis. The same mechanism, if it's also streamlined, it becomes that much more easier. Otherwise, prior to this, we were talking to several arms of the government, right? So if that's also come through, and then, like I said, data, speed of implementation, these become very, very crucial.
Fantastic. We would love to be able to talk further on that and get something done in that area. So thank you so much, Satish, for an absolutely wonderful conversation for the past 1 hour. I have to say that it was very, very insightful and also encouraging to hear from your views on these topics. So I'm going to move to a quick closing statement, if you'll allow me. So thank you all to the audience for being a part of this conversation. I know that we may not have been able to address some of your questions, though I think we have addressed quite a few going into this thing. I also want to say a quick thank you for the people who made the case study possible, which made this particular conversation with Satish Reddy possible. Starting off with Sudarshan Jain, who I can call as the Sutradhar of this entire thing, and the 6 leaders of the industry who agreed to be interviewed, some of whom agreed to be interviewed for the case study. Satish Reddy was one of them. Mr. Pankaj Patel was another. The leaders of the industry association, Sudarshan Jain, Mr. Anant Krishnan, Dara Patel, and most importantly, of course, 2 gentlemen from the government, Dr. Waghela and Dr. Somani, the Secretary, Department of Pharmaceuticals and the Drug Controller General of India. Without all of them, the case study would not have been possible. And as a unique experiment, we have kind of widely disseminated the case study even before registering it within the IIMA system. The registration process at IIMA is still underway, but we have given it away as a learning opportunity for everyone for free. Feel free to come back to us and ask us questions on the case, on any other thing. We would love to be able to continue the conversation on the case. So with that, let me hand over to Anurag and to Vishi. Thank you so much again, Satish.
Thank you. My pleasure, Arvind. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish. Thank you, Professor Sai. I request Professor Viswanath Pingali to do the honors and deliver the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Anurag. Satish, first of all, thank you for the amazing session. Arvind, first of all, following you after you've made a vote of thanks, it's going to be a little embarrassing, but let me try my best actually here. Satish, let me start with you. Thank you very much for an amazing session. Having been a previous employee of Dr. Reddy's 10 years ago, roughly, I had missed the opportunity of meeting you. I'd met Prasad, by the way, a couple of occasions, but I'd never met you. So therefore, meeting you on this forum is a great experience, and thanks a lot for your views on things. First of all, I really appreciate the fact about few things that I'm working currently on as a part of my research topic, which is policy uncertainty surrounding pharmaceuticals and healthcare industry, in the country. I thought you mentioned quite a few things about, how policy and government and industry can work together to create an ecosystem which is, which could make wonders. And if, let's say, this pandemic has made that collaboration possible in every sense of the word, I would say that, there may be something to look forward to out of this entire story. My next thanks goes to Arvind. Arvind, I think I was reading the chats and others. I thought the entire conversation and the moderation was fantastic, and therefore, thank you very much for agreeing. On behalf of SIG, Healthcare SIG, I'd like to thank you. The next one, of course, it goes without saying, Sudarshan ji, for actually thinking through this idea. I always address him as Sudarshan ji only because he's not only older to me, but he's also probably much younger to me in terms of spirit and energy. So Sudarshan ji, thank you very much for getting this going. And to the alumni office at IIM Ahmedabad, thanks guys for arranging this entire show. I would like to say this, that the Healthcare SIG at IIM Ahmedabad has made a great beginning with this talk. And I think it's really our honor to have welcomed Satish with his very distinct views on the healthcare industry at large and pharmaceutical industry in particular. I'm really definitely going to take away some views that he's expressed on API markets, on policies, and government and industry collaboration. To all the viewers, thank you very much, and we hope and look forward to this kind of a support for the future events of IIM Ahmedabad SIG in healthcare. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Satish. We'll catch up. Thanks, Sudarshan, Anurag, Devang.
Thank you very much. Thank Arvind. Went on very well and great conversation.